He never really meant it. I knew him too well to believe the words when he said them. People say things they don't mean when they're upset, and he'd been stressed lately. Work was hard, his mates were a bad influence, and I knew he wasn't sleeping. When he told me it was over, it wasn't real. It couldn't be. You don't just stop loving someone. You don't stop caring. Not like that. He just needed time, that's all. Time to remember why we worked so well together. Time to see that I was the only one who truly understood him. He thought breaking things off would make his life easier, but it wouldn't. He'd miss me soon enough. I just have to help him see it. The first week was the hardest. I tried to give him space. I really did. I stayed off his street, didn't ring him, didn't send messages, but it was hard not to check. He'd posted some photos online. Nothing much, just a picture of his dinner and a snap of his mates at the pub. That hurt, seeing him laughing with them, like nothing had happened, like I didn't matter anymore. But I told myself it was temporary. The second week, I started walking past his flat. It wasn't intentional, not at first. It was on the way to work, or near enough, and I thought I might see him heading out. I missed his face, his voice. I missed the way he smiled when he was with me. The curtains were usually shut, but sometimes there'd be a light on. He was in there, living his life, pretending I didn't exist. By the third week, I couldn't help myself. I still had the spare key. He'd given it to me in case of emergencies. I kept it on my key ring, even after he ended things. He didn't ask for it back, so that meant something, didn't it? It meant he wasn't ready to let go, not really. The first time I let myself in, I didn't go far, just the front room. I stood there for a moment, listening to the flat settle around me. It felt good to be inside again, to see his things, smell his aftershave faintly in the air. I didn't touch anything. I wasn't there to cause trouble. I just wanted to feel close to him. After that, it got easier. I started going in when I knew he'd be out. I knew his schedule. He always went to the gym on Tuesdays, and he worked late most Fridays. I never stayed long, just enough to remind myself what we had. His jacket still hung by the door, the one I'd bought him last Christmas. The mug I gave him sat on the counter, the one with the silly little pun he pretended to hate but secretly loved. That night, I couldn't stay away. It was late, well past midnight, and I knew he'd be asleep. I'd been walking past his flat for hours, trying to convince myself to go home, but something drew me back. The light in his bedroom was off, but I could see the faint glow of his alarm clock through the curtains. He'd be curled up in bed, snoring lightly like he always did when he was tired. I let myself in quietly, locking the door behind me. The flat was silent. I crept through the hallway, careful not to step on the creaky floorboard near the kitchen. His door was open a crack, just enough for me to see inside. He was there, lying on his side with the duvet pulled up to his chest. His hair was messy, his face relaxed in sleep. I stood there for a while, watching him breathe. He looked so peaceful, so familiar, it felt like coming home. I couldn't help myself. I stepped closer, my heart pounding in my chest. I knelt by the bed, close enough to hear the soft sound of his breath. He shifted slightly, muttering something in his sleep. I reached out, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. It wasn't enough. I needed to be closer. I slipped off my shoes and climbed into bed beside him, careful not to wake him. The mattress dipped slightly under my weight, and for a moment I thought he'd stir, but he didn't. He stayed where he was, his back warm against mine. It felt right, lying there with him, like nothing had changed, like he still loved me. I closed my eyes, letting the moment wash over me. Then he moved. It wasn't much, just a twitch, but it was enough to wake him. I felt him tense, his body stiffening as he realized someone was there. He turned his head, his eyes meeting mine in the dark. He reacted quickly, throwing off the duvet and scrambling out of bed. I tried to calm him, to make him understand that I wasn't there to hurt him, but he wouldn't listen. He backed away, his hand reaching for his phone. I heard him pressing buttons, his voice shaking as he spoke to someone on the other end. The police came not long after. They dragged me out of the flat, their hands rough on my arms. I called out to him as they led me away, but he wouldn't look at me. He just stood there in the doorway, his face pale and drawn. I don't understand why he's so upset. I didn't do anything wrong. I just wanted to be close to him, to remind him of what we had. He'll see that eventually. He has to. People don't just stop loving each other. Not really. She thought it was over, but it wasn't. She thought walking away would be enough, as if snapping her fingers could erase what we had. She couldn't understand that love doesn't just end. You can't turn it off like a switch, not real love. I wasn't angry, not at first. I told myself she needed time, that she would see sense. It wasn't like we hadn't fought before. It wasn't like she hadn't threatened to leave before. But this time she packed her things and went, and suddenly her side of the bed was cold. Her books weren't on the shelf. Even the scent of her shampoo was gone. I tried calling, I tried texting. She didn't respond. It wasn't fair, but I was patient. Love demands patience. I started going to the places she loved. I wasn't following her, not exactly. I just wanted to be near her, to feel connected to her again. The little cafe with the green chairs where she always ordered a chai latte, the park with the iron gates where she liked to jog, the bookstore with the creaky floorboards and that faint smell of paper and dust. She was at the bookstore when I saw her again, her head tilted to the side as she browsed the shelves. She was smiling, and it hit me like a punch to the chest. I hadn't seen her smile in weeks, not since she left. I stood outside, watching her through the window. It wasn't stalking, it was love. She didn't notice me, and that was fine. I wasn't ready for her to notice me yet. It wasn't until I saw her at the gym that I realized she was trying to replace me. She was with someone else. He wasn't much to look at, tall, lanky, with a stupid grin plastered across his face. He didn't know her. Not the way I did. He didn't know how she hated waking up before 8, or how she always fell asleep with the telly on. He didn't know she hummed to herself when she thought no one was listening. I followed them when they left. They went to his flat, a little place above a kebab shop. She deserved better than that. She deserved someone who could give her a real home, not some grotty little bedsit that probably smelled like grease and stale beer. I waited outside. Hours passed. The kebab shop closed and the street emptied. The lights in his flat stayed on, and I couldn't stop picturing them together. Her laughing at his stupid jokes, him touching her the way only I should. My hands were shaking when I got back in the car. The next few days were a blur. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, his hands, his flat above the kebab shop. I went back to the gym. She wasn't there, but he was. He was on the treadmill, earbuds in, completely oblivious. I stayed in the car, watching through the window, my fingers gripping the steering wheel so tight they ached. The days turned into weeks. I saw them together more and more. I knew their routines. I knew when they went to the gym, when they went to the cafe, when they went back to his flat. Then one night, she was alone. She left the gym on her own, her face flushed and damp with sweat. She walked to her car, looking around like she thought someone might be there. I stayed out of sight, but I followed her home. Her flat was small but cozy. The lights were on, and I could see her silhouette through the curtains. She moved around the flat, turning lights on and off, tidying up, doing little things that made her feel like herself again. I stayed outside all night. I didn't leave until the sun started to rise. The next night he disappeared. I didn't plan it. I just went to his flat, stood outside and waited. When he came out, I followed him. He didn't even notice me. Not when he crossed the street, not when he turned down the alley behind the kebab shop, not when he stopped to check his phone. I don't remember much after that. I remember the sound of his footsteps fading. I remember the cold. I remember the look on his face when he finally turned around. And when it was over, I went back to her flat. The lights were still on and she was still moving around inside, completely unaware. She thought it was over, but it wasn't. She thought walking away would be enough, but she was wrong. Love doesn't end. Not real love. And I wasn't going anywhere. It wasn't hard to find her. She thought disappearing would fix things, that leaving would be the end of it. But I know her better than anyone. She always has a pattern, same kind of place, same habits. She's a creature of routine even when she's trying to hide. It's what I always liked about her, that predictability. It makes her easy to follow. The new house was smaller than the last one, a terrace at the edge of a quiet village, quiet enough that no one would notice someone hanging around now and then. The garden was overgrown, the fence sagging in places. The windows looked like they hadn't been cleaned since she moved in. I imagined her sitting inside, curtains drawn, pretending everything was fine. I stood across the street for a while the first night I found it, looking at the shape of the place, the dim glow of the lights inside. I came back the next night, and the night after that. She didn't have much of a schedule anymore, not like she used to. She went out in the morning sometimes, groceries maybe, or to the post office, always back by early afternoon. She spent most evenings inside, lights on in the front room until late. There was a dog now, some small yappy thing. It barked when she opened the door to let it out into the garden. I'd hear it from where I stood, just out of sight. It wouldn't shut up for ages, running around like it owned the place. The dog complicated things a bit. I couldn't get close without it kicking off. I tried a couple of times stepping into the garden when I thought she was asleep, but it would start making a racket before I even reached the back door. I didn't want to rush this. I didn't want to scare her off, not yet. That's why I stayed outside for so long, walking the perimeter, watching through the gaps in the curtains. I needed to remind her I was there without saying anything outright. She needed to feel it. People like her don't learn unless they feel it. I left footprints in the garden one night, just past the back step. The grass was damp, soft enough to hold the shape of my boots. She noticed them the next day. I could see her through the window, standing there with the dog at her feet, staring down at the ground. She stood like that for a while, looking around the garden before heading back inside. She double-locked the door after that. I heard the click from where I was standing. That night was different. I waited longer than usual before approaching the house, watching the lights flicker out one by one. The dog wasn't in the garden this time. I figured she'd kept it inside, probably still nervous about the footprints. That was fine. I wanted her nervous. Nervous is good. Nervous means she's thinking about me. I'd barely reached the edge of the garden when the barking started. Not from the back door this time, but inside the house. The high-pitched yapping echoed through the street, louder than I'd expected from such a small thing. I froze, crouching low behind the fence. Her bedroom light came on a second later, spilling faint light across the upstairs window. I heard movement inside, quick and frantic. Footsteps down the stairs, the creak of floorboards. I stayed low, peeking through the gaps in the fence as the living room light flicked on. She was standing at the window now, the dog clutched in her arms. She was looking out, eyes scanning the garden. She looked pale. Even in the faint glow of the streetlights, I stayed perfectly still, watching her face as she looked closer. She was scared, properly scared. When our eyes met, something shifted. For a moment, she didn't move. She stood there, frozen, staring out at me. Then she dropped the dog, fumbling for something on the windowsill. I didn't wait to see what it was. I turned and ran, cutting through the side street and down the alley that led to the back of the village. I could hear the dog barking again, faint and muffled as I got further away. I didn't stop running until I reached the edge of the woods, doubling back to where I'd parked the car earlier. I sat there for a while, catching my breath, replaying the look on her face over and over in my mind. It was worth it, all of it, just to see that. The police must have come after I left. I didn't stick around to watch, but I know how these things go. A car parked outside, questions asked, doors checked. It wouldn't matter. They wouldn't find anything. They never do. She'll be on edge now, more than before, checking the locks, the windows, the garden. She'll keep the dog close, double-check every corner of the house before bed. That's what I wanted. That's how she should feel. It's not about hurting her, not really. It's about showing her that she can't just walk away and pretend I never happened. I'll be back soon. Not too soon, just soon enough. It wasn't about control, no matter what he thought. I never wanted to control him. I wanted to protect him, to keep him safe. That's what love is, isn't it? Looking out for someone, even when they don't see the danger themselves, even when they don't understand why you're doing it. He always thought he was so independent, so capable, but I knew better. I saw the way people took advantage of him, his mates, his co-workers, even strangers in the street. They'd smile at him, say the right things, and he'd believe them. He was too trusting, too naive to realize when someone had bad intentions. That's where I came in. I was the one who saw through it all, the one who knew when people were lying or trying to use him. He hated that about me, said I was jealous, paranoid, but I wasn't. I was paying attention. After he ended things, I didn't know what to do. It was like losing a part of myself, like losing the only thing that ever made sense. I spent the first few days pacing my flat, staring at my phone, waiting for him to call and apologize. But he didn't. He moved on, like I was nothing, like we'd never mattered. It was unbearable. So I decided to help him, from a distance. He didn't want me around, but that didn't mean I couldn't look out for him. That's when I bought the tracker. It wasn't expensive, just a small black device with a sticky back that could be hidden under his car. I told myself it wasn't a big deal. It was just a way to make sure he was safe, that he wasn't driving to places he shouldn't be, or meeting people who'd hurt him. The first time I placed it, I was shaking. I'd parked down the street from his flat, watching for ages to make sure he wasn't coming out. When the coast was clear, I crept up to his car and crouched down, pressing the tracker onto the underside of the bumper. My heart was pounding the entire time. I felt like a criminal, but it was worth it. The app on my phone showed his location in real time. I'd check it a few times a day just to see where he was. Work, the gym, the supermarket. It was all normal, predictable. That made me feel better, knowing he wasn't going anywhere dangerous or meeting anyone new. But then he started driving to places I didn't recognize, a coffee shop across town, a park on the edge of the city, places he'd never mentioned before. It didn't make sense. I spent hours staring at the map, trying to figure out what he was doing. Was he meeting someone? Was it a woman? The thought made my stomach twist. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I waited until he was asleep and let myself into his flat. I still had the spare key. He never asked for it back. It was his fault, really. If he didn't want me coming in, he should have taken it. I didn't go far, just the front room. I stood there, looking around at his things, trying to piece together what he'd been up to. The same mugs on the counter, the same pile of post on the table. Nothing had changed. It was almost like I'd never left. I couldn't resist checking his phone. It was on the coffee table, unlocked. I swiped through his messages, his emails, his photos. Nothing suspicious, no new names, no conversations that seemed out of place. Maybe I'd been wrong. Maybe he wasn't meeting anyone after all. The next morning, I checked the tracker again. He'd driven to another new place, a pub in a part of town I didn't know. I sat in my car outside, watching the entrance, waiting for him to come out. When he finally did, he wasn't alone. There was a woman with him, laughing at something he'd said. They got into her car and drove off together. I followed them, keeping a safe distance. They went to her flat, a small tidy place with flower boxes on the windows. I parked down the street and watched the lights go on in her living room. I stayed there for hours, waiting for him to leave. He didn't. The next day, he confronted me. He must have found the tracker. He came to my door, shouting, accusing me of being crazy, of crossing the line. I stayed calm, smiling, pretending I didn't know what he was talking about. I told him it was a coincidence, that I didn't know anything about it. He didn't believe me, of course, but it didn't matter. I'd done what I needed to do. Now I watch from farther away. I don't need the tracker anymore. I know where he goes, who he's with. I know her name, her address, her schedule. I'm still looking out for him, still protecting him, even if he doesn't realize it. One day he'll understand. One day he'll see that I was right all along. She always thought she was smarter than me. That's what stung the most, I think. It wasn't the breakup. I knew she didn't have the guts to handle something real, something deep. But the way she did it, like she was untangling herself from a mess, like I was some mistake. I can't stand people who think they can walk away without consequences. I don't care who you are. Actions have consequences. That's just how it is. She didn't notice me at first. Not properly. That was the fun of it, really. Walking just far enough behind her on the path to the library that my footsteps could have been anyone's. Sticking to the edge of the car park while she fumbled for her keys. It's amazing how many blind spots there are in the world if you're willing to look for them. If you want to disappear, you can. I learned that fast. She'd changed her routine a little since we'd split, stayed out late in public spaces, library and cafes mostly, and then bolted home all at once. She thought being around people made her safe. It made her predictable. There's nothing safer for someone like me than predictable. The camera was the first proper step. It was easy to get inside her flat. She never locked her window, which was asking for trouble, really. I climbed in during the day when I knew she'd be out. A quick look around her room told me everything I needed to know. The posters, the neatly stacked textbooks, the pictures she kept of her family. I wasn't in any of them, of course, not anymore. The camera went into the air vent above her bed. It was almost like it was made for something like that. The gap between the slats was just big enough for a good angle, and I could access the feed from my phone anytime. She never noticed. Not at first. She spent too much time on her phone or typing away on her laptop to look up. The idea that someone might be looking down at her clearly never crossed her mind. The days after that were a blur of footage. Watching her sleep, watching her study, watching her brush her teeth. Ordinary things, really, but they felt extraordinary to me. It wasn't about what she was doing. It was about being there, knowing what she didn't want me to know. Things went sideways when she found the camera. I'll admit that wasn't my best moment. I'd adjusted it the day before, trying to get a clearer view of the whole room, and maybe I left it a little too obvious. She spotted it when she was cleaning, and the way she froze told me she knew exactly what it was. She called the landlord first, then the police, then the university. It spiraled fast after that. I kept my distance while it all unfolded, staying out of sight, but close enough to hear about it. People on campus started whispering, pointing, looking over their shoulders. My name came up too often. It wasn't long before I got called in for questioning. They didn't have enough to pin it on me outright. I wasn't stupid enough to leave fingerprints or anything they could use in court, but they didn't need proof to make their point. They kicked me out of the university a week later, said it was for violating community standards. As if that mattered now. I don't blame her for that. I blame her for what came next. She thought she'd won. I could see it in the way she started walking with her head up again, the way she stopped double-checking the locks on her door. She threw the camera away, got a new phone, even moved into a new flat, like that would make any difference. I found her again easily. She didn't think about what she posted online, where she checked in. It wasn't hard to track her down. The new flat's in a quieter part of town, fewer people around. She comes home late some nights, and the streets are practically empty when she does. It's the perfect place for her to be alone. I've been following her routine again, learning the rhythm of her life. I know where she shops, what time she takes the bus, which pub she likes to stop at for a drink after class. She's predictable again, even more than before. I've been inside the new flat twice. I'm better at it now, more careful. I don't leave anything behind, nothing she can find. I know better than to put a camera in the open. She checks for them now, sweeps the room with her phone light. It's almost funny to watch. She's looking so hard for something she'll never see. This is bigger than the camera now, bigger than her thinking she's outsmarted me. It's not about the footage or the flat or the fact that she pretends I don't exist when she walks past the places we used to go. It's about proving something to her, to myself. She's mine, she's always been mine. She just doesn't know it yet. It wasn't how I wanted things to go, none of it was. I never thought it would come to this. Standing in the cold outside her flat, watching the lights go on and off. She didn't even pull the curtains anymore, not like when we were together. Back then she'd say she hated people looking in, now it seemed she didn't care. That was why I was there. Someone had to care. The divorce was her idea, not mine. She said she couldn't take it anymore, but she never explained what it was. I thought we were doing fine. Sure, we had arguments, but who doesn't? I thought she'd calm down once she had some time to think. Instead, she moved out, left me with nothing but an empty house and a lawyer's bill that would choke a horse. I'd tried calling, tried texting, nothing. She blocked me. That wasn't fair. After all we'd been through, she owed me at least a conversation. I had to hear it from her face to face. I needed to understand. Finding her wasn't hard. The new place wasn't far, just a few streets over. A modest flat, the kind where the walls are thin and the doors always seem to stick in the frame. It didn't suit her, but maybe that was the point. Maybe she thought she could start over there, leave everything behind, leave me behind. I didn't knock the first night I went. I stood across the road, leaning against a lamppost, just looking. Her car was parked outside, a little dent in the bumper that hadn't been there before. She always was a terrible driver. I wondered what she was doing inside, watching telly, reading one of those paperback novels she loved. Did she think about me at all? It was colder than I expected, standing out there. I'd shoved my hands in my pockets, rocking back and forth on my heels when she came to the window. My breath caught, and I ducked behind a parked van. She didn't see me. She stood there for a while, looking out at the street. I couldn't read her expression. It wasn't long before she turned off the light and disappeared back inside. I told myself it was a one-off, just needed to see her to make sure she was okay. But the next night, I found myself there again. And the night after that, it became routine part of my day. I'd finish work, grab something to eat, and then drive over. She started noticing. I could tell by the way she'd glance out the window, her eyes scanning the street. She knew I was there even if she didn't acknowledge me. It was like a game, a standoff. She wanted me to leave, but I couldn't. Not yet. Then she started changing her habits. She'd take the bins out at odd times, slipping out quickly and darting back inside. She stopped using the front door as much, opting for the back entrance instead. It didn't matter. I always knew where she was. The letters came next. I'd write them at night, sitting in my car under the street lamp, page after page telling her how sorry I was, how much I missed her. I'd slip them through the letterbox when no one was around. I imagined her reading them, her eyes filling with tears as she realized how much I cared, but she didn't respond. Not to the letters, not to the flowers I left on her doorstep, not to the voicemail I left from a payphone. I saw him one night, some bloke coming out of her flat wearing a jacket that wasn't his, and he wasn't much taller than me, scruffy looking with a face that made my blood boil. He laughed at something she said, the sound carrying across the quiet street. They stood there for a while talking before he got into his car and drove off. I couldn't sleep that night. My thoughts were racing, twisting, turning, pulling me in directions I didn't want to go. The next day, I drove past her flat during my lunch break. The curtains were drawn, but I could see her as silhouette against the fabric, moving around. I parked across the street and waited. It was dark when she came out. She had her coat on, her bag slung over one shoulder. She didn't look around, didn't notice me sitting there. She walked quickly, her heels clicking against the pavement, disappearing around the corner. I followed her. I stayed far enough behind that she wouldn't notice. She went to a cafe, sat at a table by the window. I stood outside, my breath fogging the glass as I watched her sip her coffee, her eyes scanning a magazine she'd brought with her. She looked normal, like nothing had happened. When she left, I didn't follow her back to the flat. Instead, I went home, my mind buzzing with everything I'd seen. That night, I sat in my car outside her building again. The lights in her flat were on, but the curtains were drawn. I waited for hours, long after the other flats had gone dark. She didn't come to the window again, but I wasn't leaving, not yet. I shouldn't have had to find her like this. She always made things difficult, though. It's just like her to pick a place so remote, thinking I wouldn't notice, but I did. It took weeks of quiet searching, and when I saw the little house nestled at the edge of the woods, I knew it was hers. It felt like it should be hers. Too neat, too lonely, perfect. The house isn't much, weathered wood, a roof that sags in one corner. The kind of place you could forget was there if you weren't paying attention. The garden's overgrown, the trees hanging low as if they're trying to hide it. She probably thought it was safe here, that she was safe. It makes me laugh when I think about it. I didn't go up to the house right away. I walked the perimeter first, watched how she moved inside. The curtains tugged shut as if that would make a difference. The lights came on as the evening fell, glowing faintly through thin fabric. I could see her shape in the window, moving between the kitchen and the living room. Everything about her is the same. The way she moves, the tilt of her head when she's thinking. She never changes, not really. I wanted to step closer, but not yet. There's no need to rush. The woods around the house are perfect for staying unseen. I made paths through them, places where I could sit, wait. It felt good to carve something new into the landscape, to make it mine in the way that I've always wanted to make her mine. I could see her in the yard sometimes, hanging clothes or brushing leaves off the porch. She didn't look out into the trees often, which was smart. If she had, she might have seen me. I went inside the house the first night. I felt the timing was right. She'd gone to bed early, and the place went quiet except for the wind rattling the windows. The door at the back was easy. Cheap lock, useless. Her kind of lock. I stood in the kitchen for a long while, taking in the way she'd decorated it. Everything was hers. Even the plates and mugs looked like her. I didn't touch anything, though I wanted to. It felt too soon. She wouldn't understand yet, not yet. The next few times I stayed longer. I moved things, little things, shifted a chair out of place or tipped the corner of a rug. I left the cupboard doors slightly ajar. I needed her to feel me there, to know that I was close, even if she didn't realize how close. She's always been sharp, but not as sharp as she thinks. She blamed the wind or herself or nothing at all. I could tell by the way she kept checking over her shoulder, though. She was beginning to feel it. That made me happy. It wasn't long before I couldn't resist leaving something more. Something personal. The cologne was the easiest way, just a faint trace in the air, enough to make her pause. She froze when she noticed it, standing in the hallway with her head tilted slightly, sniffing the air like a nervous animal. I watched from the tree line. She rushed to every door and window, locking them all as if that would matter, as if I couldn't already be inside. The cameras were clever, I'll give her that. She set them up the day after she smelled it. I saw her fiddling with the little boxes, her hands shaking. I thought about staying away, about giving her space to settle into a false sense of security, but I couldn't. I needed to see her. I needed to be near her. The cameras weren't a problem. They were cheap like the lock, and I know how to move without being seen. I came in through the same door, easing it shut behind me. Her bedroom door was half open. She sleeps on her side, facing the wall. The cameras couldn't see me from where they were. I stood in the doorway, watching her breathe. Her hair spilled across the pillow, and her hand was curled under her chin. She looked so small. I wanted to reach out, but I didn't, not yet. When I checked the cameras the next day, I saw her reaction. She'd noticed something. I must have left a footprint or brushed against the wall. I can't be sure. Her face was pale, her mouth pressed into a thin line as she scrolled through the footage. She replayed the same bit over and over, the one where the bedroom door moved slightly. It wasn't enough to show me, but it was enough to make her panic. She didn't sleep that night. I could see the glow of her phone through the curtain, the shadows shifting as she paced back and forth. I stayed outside this time. It felt right to give her some space to think, to let her imagine. I think she's beginning to understand. It's been weeks now and she looks different. She keeps the curtains closed all the time, the lights low. She doesn't go outside much anymore. She looks tired, worn down. She should be. It's tiring, isn't it? Always looking over your shoulder, wondering who might be watching, wondering when they might step closer. I don't know when I'll make my move. It doesn't feel urgent. She knows I'm here now. Even if she doesn't know who, that's enough for now. It's enough to watch her from the edge of the trees, to slip into her house while she's sleeping, to leave little reminders of how close I've been. It's enough to know that she's mine again, in the way that matters most, for now. It wasn't over. People like to say things when they're angry or confused, and that's all it was. He didn't mean it when he said he wanted me out of his life. I understood him better than he understood himself. And I knew he was just scared of how much he needed me. It was hard at first not being there all the time. I'd gotten so used to the sound of his voice, the feel of his presence. It was like missing a limb. I tried to give him the space he thought he wanted. But then, space isn't what love is about, is it? Love is about being close, even when it's difficult. Especially when it's difficult. I didn't know he was serious until he changed his locks. That stung more than I thought it would. I still had the key, the one he gave me when things were good, but it didn't matter anymore. I tried it one evening when the flat was dark and quiet, and it just wouldn't turn. That was when I knew I'd have to try harder. The idea for the job came to me when I was walking past his office one day. It was one of those glass-fronted buildings, all gleaming windows and people in suits bustling about. I could see him through the glass, sitting at his desk, his head bent over some papers. He looked tired, like he hadn't been sleeping well. It wasn't hard to figure out what the company did. A bit of online research, a polished-up CV, and a few interviews later, and I was hired. Not in the same department, of course, that would have been too obvious, but close enough. Close enough to see him in the break room, to hear his voice in meetings, to feel his presence in the same building. He didn't notice me at first, or maybe he pretended not to. He had that way of acting like everything was fine, like he wasn't bothered by anything. But I could tell he knew. I'd see his shoulders tense when I walked into a room, or how his eyes would dart to the floor when I passed by his desk. The flat came later. That was harder to arrange. His building was one of those older ones, the kind with creaky stairs and neighbours who didn't bother locking their doors. I watched the estate agent's website for weeks, waiting for something to come up nearby. When a place opened across the road, I jumped on it. It wasn't much, just a studio with peeling wallpaper and a dodgy boiler, but it had a view straight into his living room. I spent the first few nights just sitting by the window watching the lights in his flat. He had a habit of leaving the curtains open even at night. I could see him moving about, making tea, watching TV, pacing the floor with his phone pressed to his ear. It felt like being home again almost. The job and the flat made everything easier. I could keep an eye on him without having to sneak around. I could see who he was talking to, where he was going, what he was doing. He didn't have to know I was there. It wasn't about spying. It was about protecting him, making sure he was okay, but he wasn't okay, I could tell. He looked thinner, more tired. He'd started leaving the office early, avoiding the usual after-work drinks with his colleagues. He was shutting people out, retreating into himself. I knew he needed me more than ever. I started leaving things for him, little reminders. A coffee cup on his desk at work, just the way he liked it. A note tucked under his windscreen wiper, something simple like, "Take care of yourself." I didn't sign them. It wasn't about me, it was about making sure he knew someone cared. Then one night he closed the curtains. It was the first time he'd done it since I moved in. I stood at my window for hours, staring at the blank space where his flat used to be. It felt like he was shutting me out, like he was trying to push me away again. The next day at work he called in sick. I knew he wasn't ill, he never got sick. I wanted to check on him, but I didn't want to overstep. Instead, I walked past his building on my way home, hoping to catch a glimpse of him through the lobby window. The lights in his flat were off, but his car was still in its usual spot. It was late when I heard the noise. A car door slamming, footsteps on the pavement. I moved to the window and peered through the gap in the curtains. He was outside talking to someone, a woman. She was laughing at something he'd said, her hand brushing his arm. Something inside me twisted. I knew her from the office. She was in marketing, always hanging around his desk, always finding excuses to talk to him. I'd seen the way she looked at him, like he was hers to take. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning he was back at work, acting like nothing had happened, but I could see it in his eyes, the way they flicked to her whenever she walked past. He thought he could replace me, that she could give him what we had. He was wrong. He'll see eventually. He'll understand that what we had wasn't something you could walk away from. Love doesn't work like that. You can't just end it. Not really. It's still there whether you want it to be or not.